So, I'm afraid my talk is going to be disappointingly low tech, because all I'm going to do is read out my manuscript, and then you have your handouts in order to make it easier for you to follow my talk. But I haven't actually set up a PowerPoint presentation. And I think perhaps I should apologize for that. So we begin right at the beginning, namely with the introduction to my paper. This paper is about an exegetical puzzle about the early phase of Wilfrid Sellers's philosophical work. I find it helpful to think about the 9 years between the publication of Sellers's first essay, Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology in 1947, and his 1956 London lectures on the myth of the given as a period of continuous philosophical development in which Sellers's overarching metaphilosophical and methodological commitments settle and the outlines of his philosophical system take shape. But on the face of it, there appears to be a deep rift between Sellers's earliest 3 essays and the bulk of his work up to empiricism and the philosophy of mind. At the heart of Sellers's first 3 essays lies a staunch commitment to a clear-cut demarcation between philosophy and empirical science. Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology. Epistemology and the New Way of Words, that's Sellers's second published essay. And Realism and the New Way of Words pursue the ambitious goal of laying the conceptual and methodological foundation for a genuinely non-factualistic approach to philosophical questions, an approach which avoids the pitfall of psychologism much more carefully than does, according to Sellers, the mainstream of analytic philosophy in the wake of Frege, Wittgenstein, and Carnap. Apparently, the very early Sellers sees the key to success in a bold extension of the formalistic master strategy of the first phase of analytical philosophy. A bold extension to all genuinely philosophical concepts of that formalistic master strategy. I got a little bit carried away when reading it out. As he puts it in Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology, quote, "A philosophical concept must be decidable on purely formal grounds." To live up to this claim, Sellers sets out to sketch the outlines of a formal meta-theoretical framework which is rich enough to clarify the notion of a language as used in a world. In rough outline, this is the gist of Sellers's famous project of Pure Pragmatics. There can be no doubt that there occurred a change of direction in Sellers's published work around the year 1948. Beginning with Language, Rules and Behavior, the peculiar stress on formalism and the application of formal methods in philosophy suddenly disappears. What is more, in Language, Rules and Behavior, and later in some reflections on language games, Sellers even turns directly to the task of sketching the outline of what he refers to as an adequate psychology of rule-regulated behavior. Did Sellers give up on the most cherished ambitions of his first 3 essays and succumb to factualism after all? In the present paper, I shall attempt to sketch an argument for the claim that, despite initial appearances, Sellers's post-1948 turn does not involve a significant shift in meta-philosophical commitments. In particular, I shall try to show that the special sense in which Sellers, in his earliest essays, spoke of philosophy as a formal enterprise, remains by and large valid after 1948. Thus, there is a sense in which Sellers's philosophy remains committed to the philosophical project of pure pragmatics as envisioned in his earliest essays. From this perspective, Sellers's occupation with the psychology of rule-regulated behavior does not mark a relapse or a lapse into philosophical factualism, but Sellers's work on the foundations of cognition isn't merely an inconsequential exercise in armchair science either. As I see it, what Sellers is really after is to reconcile the meta-philosophical vision of his first three essays with the guiding insight behind his scientia mensura principle. The result is a naturalistic pragmatics which takes full measure of the insight that it is science which provides our best take on what conceptual activity really is, while remaining committed to the methodological and conceptual autonomy of philosophy. From here on, I'm going to proceed in 3 steps. In the first part of this paper, I will attempt to give a brief overview of the general idea behind Sellers's earliest 3 essays. After that, in part 2, I'm going to defend the idea that Sellers's self-confessed formalism in his early works is based on a peculiar and highly idiosyncratic conception of the formal. To put it in a nutshell, as I see it, Sellers's commitment to a formalistic conception of philosophy comes down to a commitment to the idea that the task of philosophy is to clarify or explicate the system of functional roles which serves as a norm for our factual linguistic behavior. In the third and concluding part of this paper, I'm going to distinguish between 2 different but complementary routes by which this task can be addressed. The phenomenology of linguistic functions is the attempt to explicate language as a system of functional roles from within by employing the resources of syntactical and semantical meta-languages. But as Sellers sees it, this phenomenological approach fails to take us all the way. In order to achieve complete success, we have to combine it with the naturalistic pragmatics of languages or conceptual systems in general. Now, that was a very long introduction, and perhaps this is the time to ask whether everyone in this room can understand me, whether I'm... Okay, perfect. Good. Then I continue with the second part of my talk, Sellers's earliest essays, A Quick Tour. Wilfrid Sellers's earliest 3 essays are overwhelmingly dense and full of remarkable insights. Accordingly, it isn't exactly easy to say in a few words what they are about. But when we take in the bird's eye view, the large contours present themselves roughly as follows. Sellers's earliest 3 essays address the task of constructing a meta-theoretical framework for clarifying the notion of what Sellers calls an empirically meaningful language. That is to say, a language that is used in the world it is about. They constitute an attempt to bring out what structure a language must have in order to embody empirical or factual knowledge. In short, pure pragmatics and epistemology, epistemology and the new way of words, and realism and the new way of words provide an explication of the representational dimension of languages or conceptual systems in general. Sellers's point of departure in his earliest essays is the existing meta-theoretical framework of formal semantics as developed by, among others, Tarski and Carnap. Sellers begins his dialectics with the diagnosis that the conceptual framework of pure semantics is, as yet, incomplete in a way which leads to a confusion of distinctively philosophical concepts with the concepts of the empirical sciences, and in particular with psychological concepts. As a remedy, Sellers proposes to enrich the existing framework of pure semantics by introducing a new class of metalinguistic rules. Carnap's semantical systems incorporate three classes of metalinguistic rules: formation and transformation rules, designation rules, and truth rules. Sellers's alternative framework does without designation rules and truth rules, but alongside Carnap's transformation and formation rules, Sellers introduces what he calls conformation rules. Conformation rules constrain the combining properties of predicates and individual constants. By drawing on conformation rules, it becomes possible, according to Sellers, to define concepts such as verified, confirmed, type, token, or world story as formally decidable predicates. Sellers calls the enriched semantical framework, thus construed, pure pragmatics. In his earliest three essays, Sellers leaves no doubt that he regards pure pragmatics as a project which continues and indeed completes the formal theory of language. This understanding of pure pragmatics goes hand in hand with what appears to be a strictly formalistic understanding of philosophy itself. The following two quotations give us a good impression of how Sellers talks about philosophy in his pure pragmatics phase. Quote, "Philosophy is pure formalism, pure theory of language," unquote. Quote, "I shall argue that philosophy is properly conceived of as the pure theory of empirically meaningful languages, and that pure semantics, as it now exists, is but a fragment of such a theory," unquote. Passages such as these make it clear that for Sellers, pure pragmatics wasn't just one philosophical project among others, but rather the focal point of philosophy's enterprise at large. And as the following passage from Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology shows, his hopes were high indeed. Quote, "The linguistic tools shaped in pure pragmatics will make possible and indeed necessitate a return to the Aufbau stage of logical empiricism, but with a conception of Aufbau which is as much richer than that of the early 30s as the psychologism of Kant is richer than that of Hume," unquote. Sellers advertised his earliest three essays as a bold attempt to set the stage for a new phase in the history of the formal theory of language and analytic philosophy in general. Judged by these ambitions, they didn't quite succeed. Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology, Epistemology and the New Way of Words, and Realism and the New Way of Words didn't have much of a reception history, and the few reactions we know of were mixed, to say the least. Sellers clearly failed to convince analytical philosophers that a change in the direction indicated by him was indeed necessary. By and large, it seems fair to say that Sellers's proposal to advance the meta-theory of languages into the stage of pure pragmatics wasn't too congenial to conventional formal linguistics. Rudolf Carnap's lukewarm reaction to Sellers's early work is a particularly interesting case in point. In a letter from May 1947, Carnap comments on epistemology and the new way of words as follows. Your manuscript, Epistemology and, contains some interesting ideas, especially that of confronting sense data with sentence tokens. However, many things in it are not clear to me, and about others I have some doubts, perhaps merely caused by the brevity of formulation. Unquote. Carnap then goes on to point out several technical problems regarding Sellers's argument. Equally interesting is, of course, Sellers's own perspective. In his correspondence of the late 1940s, Sellers repeatedly expressed doubts about whether his essays are really up to the technical standards of the formal branch of analytical philosophy. To take just one example, in a draft of a letter to his former mentor C.I. Lewis, a notable Harvard philosopher, Sellers remarks about the genesis of pure pragmatics and epistemology as follows. Quote, I was not only groping for an adequate account of verification and meaningfulness as epistemological concepts, I was also in the process of familiarizing myself, to some extent refamiliarizing myself with the techniques of modern linguistic analysis, with the result that some parts of it are quite confused and it contains some downright mistakes. But then I think it also contains some inkling of the truth, unquote. So much for the second part of my talk. I go on with the third part, Sellers' conception of the formal a red herring. As we have seen, pure pragmatics addresses the task of constructing a meta-theoretical framework for explicating the notion of a language as used in a world. At the same time, the guiding concern of Sellers' meta-philosophical reflections in his first three essays is to sharply demarcate philosophical discourse from factual discourse. Sellers emphatically insists on a non-factualistic understanding of philosophical concepts. In this context, Sellers employs formal as the contrasting term to factual. Thus, for Sellers, it is precisely the formality of philosophical discourse which is supposed to provide the demarcation criterion against factual discourse. What does Sellers understand by formal? The following passage from Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology gives us a first hint. Quote, the realization that philosophical truth could not be factual truth, combined with too narrow a conception of the formal, has led to the Wittgensteinian contention that there are no philosophical propositions. I hope to make clear that this is a mistake, while granting that, in a sense, the Wittgensteinians have the last word, unquote. According to this passage, Sellers intends his conception of the formal to be broader than Wittgenstein's understanding of this concept. In order to bypass all the notorious exegetical issues concerning the Tractatus, I shall presuppose that Wittgenstein's understanding of formal is essentially the conception of the formal shared by the analytic tradition. Let us call this understanding the received conception of the formal, and take Rudolf Carnap as a paradigmatic representative. His Foundations of Logic and Mathematics, Carnap defines formal as follows, quote, a definition of a term in the meta-language is called formal if it refers only to the expressions of the object language, or more exactly to the kinds of signs and the order in which they occur in the expressions, but not to any extralinguistic objects, and especially not to the designator of the descriptive signs of the object language, unquote. According to the received conception of the formal, formal concepts characterize linguistic items only as instances of a particular sign design, that is to say, as falling into classes of physical marks, for example, classes of shapes and sounds. In his 1950 paper, The Identity of Linguistic Expressions and the Paradox of Analysis, Sellers introduces a handy notational device for forming metalinguistic expressions which refer to such classes, his star quotes. By putting an expression into star quotes, Sellers means to form a metalinguistic sortal. The extension of this sortal is the class of linguistic items which conform to the same pattern of marks or sign design as the star-quoted expression. Thus, the star-quoted expression dog refers to the class of linguistic items which consists of a D-shaped grapheme followed by an O-shaped grapheme followed in turn by a G-shaped grapheme. The intension of the star-quoted expression dog, on the other hand, is the abstract sign design or pattern of marks to which the members of the class of DUG-shaped graphemes must conform. Needless to say that the exact scope of both the extension and the intension of a metalinguistic sortal formed with the help of star quotes is subject to conventions and pragmatical considerations. These remarks can be put more conveniently, or these considerations can be put more conveniently by drawing on the type token distinction as introduced by Charles Sanders Peirce. What Peirce refers to as a type is exactly the intension of a metalinguistic sortal formed by the use of star quotes. That is to say, an abstract sign design or pattern of marks. In other words, the type dog is the star-quoted expression dog. Tokens of the type dog, on the other hand, are all those linguistic items which fall into the extension of the star-quoted dog. They are members of a class of linguistic items which share the same sign design. Employing the type token distinction, we can express the upshot of our initial characterization of the formal much more succinctly this way. The formal is language qua type. Accordingly, a formal approach would be one that takes linguistic items only as instances of types into account. In his earliest essays, Sellers proposes to revise and reinterpret Peirce's type token distinction. Thus, Sellers introduces the new technical term token class for classes of linguistic items which share the same pattern of marks or sign design. Peirce's notion of a type, however, is put to an entirely different metalinguistic use. Sellers proposes to use the term type for the norms or standards which govern the use of linguistic items. In Realism and the New Way of Words, Sellers puts this idea in this way, quote, "It will help clarify the relation of symbol types to symbol tokens if we think of the former as norms and standards and of the latter as events that satisfy them," unquote. And in Pure Pragmatics and Epistemology, Sellers simply speaks about, quote, "language as norm or type," unquote. What Sellers has in mind becomes much clearer in ILE and in quotation marks, sentences and propositions, another paper published in 1950. In ILE, Sellers interprets types in his sense of the term as linguistic roles. He attempts to bring out what he means by this by drawing on an analogy to the game of chess. Quote, "If one were asked what is a knight in the game of chess, one might be tempted to reply by describing the shape of a knight in one's chess set. This, however, would clearly be a mistake. Fundamentally, then, chessmen are roles, and the roles are specified by the rules of chess. Our distinction between linguistic roles, token classes, and tokens is exactly mirrored by the distinction between chess roles, chess set designs, and the individual pieces in my chess set. Just as chessmen are roles specified by rules, so the roles of a language are roles specified by rules," unquote. Types, in Sellers's sense of the term, are functional roles which are shared by linguistic items insofar as they are subject to the same, or at least relevantly similar, linguistic rules. The rules in question are, of course, specified with respect to token classes. In other words, a functional role is a class of rules which govern the use of particular token classes of linguistic items. A functional role is not, and this point seems to be important, a second-order class of linguistic items, such as the class of the token classes which are subject to the same linguistic rules. Nor is a functional role a class of types in Peirce's sense of the term, namely a class of abstract patterns of marks or sign designs. Again, Sellers comes up with a handy notational device for forming metalinguistic sortals, which pick out linguistic items according to their functional role, namely his dot quotes. Thus, the intention of the expression, the intention of the dot-quoted expression dog is the functional role which is played, for example, by star-quoted dogs in English, star-quoted Hunds in German, or star-quoted chiens in French. According to our previous analysis, this functional role is the class of rules which govern the use of star-quoted dogs in English. The extension of the dot-quoted dog is the class of all token classes which are, in the language to which they belong, subject to the same rules as star-quoted dogs are in English. We are now finally in a position to clarify what Sellers understands by formal in his earliest essays. We can put the gist of the matter in this way. For both Sellers and the analytical tradition, the formal is language qua type. But here we face a clear-cut case of an equivocation. Sellers uses the term type in another sense than the analytical tradition. For the analytical tradition, the formal is language qua type in Peirce's sense of the term, namely language as a system of abstract patterns of marks or sign designs. For Sellers, on the other hand, the formal equals language qua type in his sense of the term, namely language as a system of functional roles. This reading of Sellers' understanding of the formal is supported by an inconspicuous passage in Sellers' 1950 essay, Quotation Marks, Sentences and Propositions. After having introduced the concept of a type in the way sketched above, Sellers states, quote, "This analysis leads to the conclusion that the formal study of a language does not consist of the study of language qua patterns of mark, but rather in what might legitimately be called the phenomenology of linguistic functions. I've come to realize that my use of the word formal in several papers has been confused and misleading," unquote. As it now seems, Sellers' self-identification as a formalist in his earliest essays rests largely on ambiguity. When he refers to philosophy as pure formalism, Sellers does not necessarily mean to commit himself to the application of formal methods in the received sense of the term. Instead, he champions the idea that the target of philosophical activity is language qua type in his sense of the term, namely language as a system of functional roles which serves as the norm for factual linguistic behavior. Without any doubt, Sellers took his divergent understanding of formal to be a decisive step forward. For his target audience in the formal branch of analytical philosophy, however, this manner of speaking must have been a massive red herring. So this concludes the third part of my manuscript. We are almost through. Now there's only the fourth and final part left. Part 4, the phenomenology of linguistic functions and the idea of a naturalistic pragmatics. For Sellers, the philosopher and the empirical scientist pursue quite different objectives. According to Sellers' understanding of philosophy, the task of the philosopher is to get clear about language as norm. That is to say, language as a system of conceptual norms, roles, and functions, which serves as some sort of a regulative ideal for our imperfect and untidy factual linguistic behavior. Empirical science, on the other hand, addresses the task of describing and explaining factual linguistic behavior. And the catchy terminology of Sellers' first 3 essays, the empirical scientist is not concerned with language as norm, but with language as fact. Even where an empirical scientist might be interested in the norms which govern the behavior of a group of people, the scientist is not after quite the same thing as the philosopher. While, for example, an anthropologist would be interested in describing the functional roles which are constitutive for the behavior of a particular group of people, the philosopher cares about straightening out what goes wrong with the norms that bind us. To put it very bluntly, for Sellers, philosophy can lay claim to be staunchly non-factualistic because it is all about the ideal, all about what ought to be, and not about what is the case, namely our clumsy attempts to live up to the norms we espouse. In the present paper, I can do no more than simply point to the results of Sellers' extended reflections on the goal of the philosophical enterprise, which are to be found in his early essays. Consider the following 2 quotations from Realism and the New Way of Words. Quote, "Clarification is the significant element in philosophical activity, however its nature be conceived." Unquote. And the second quotation, quote, "Behind the therapeutic activity of the modern Socrates lies the medicine kit of a more or less fully developed pure theory of empirically meaningful languages." Unquote. Without further argument, let us simply stipulate that for Sellers, the aim of philosophy is to clarify and perhaps also to rectify the functional roles which serve as norms for our factual linguistic behavior. We shall use the verb to explicate as a technical term for the special way in which the philosopher deals with functional roles. As we understand the term functional, as we understand this term, a functional role is nothing else but a class of rules which govern the use of a particular class of linguistic items. Consequently, the task of explicating a particular functional role comes down to setting out as precisely as possible the rules which should belong to the class in question, perhaps in the form of a list. According to the passage from quotation mark sentences and propositions, which I have quoted earlier, the formal study of a language, that is to say, the study of language as a system of functional roles, is the same thing as the phenomenology of linguistic functions. Does phenomenology provide us with a way to get a grip on the individual rules which constitute functional roles? As I understand Sellers' brief remarks on phenomenology, he is indeed committed to this idea. But let us take a look on how this passage goes on. Quote, "Phenomenology, as I interpret it, is the systematic exhibition of the rules of a language by the use of that same language for this purpose. The phenomenology of language is the exhibitory use of syntactical and semantical meta-languages, meta-meta-languages, etc. We exhibit the rules whereby we use such words as sentence, true, actual, etc. Unquote. For Sellers, the phenomenology of linguistic functions addresses the task of setting out the individual rules which constitute functional roles by employing the conceptual resources of syntactical and semantical discourse. In other words, what the practitioner of phenomenology really does, though she may not be fully aware of it, is to explicate functional roles. Ideally, the explicative activity of the phenomenologist would result in something like a list of the formation rules, transformation rules, and conformation rules which constitute particular functional roles. According to Sellers, the phenomenologist attempts to compile such a list by following the clues which her own metalinguistic behavior provides. As a competent speaker of English, the phenomenologist is, for example, perfectly capable of discerning graphical patterns which are expressions in English from those which are not. And she can make use of this ability in reconstructing the rules for the formation of expressions in English. In a similar manner, the phenomenologist can draw on her ability to discern those expressions in English which are sentences from those which are not, in order to reconstruct the rules for the formation of sentences in English. After the phenomenologist is done with reconstructing the formation rules of English, she can try to tackle the transformation rules in roughly the same fashion. Thus, she could use her ability to discern those pairs of sentences which can be substituted for one another in each linguistic context from those which cannot, in order to reconstruct the rules for the logical equivalence of sentences in English. It is not hard to see how a skilled enough phenomenologist could indeed get a firm grip on the totality of the formation and transformation rules of English by exploiting her own competent use of a syntactical meta-language. The conformation rules, however, are a much more complicated case. From now on, our phenomenologist will have to draw on the resources of her semantical meta-languages, of a semantical meta-language as well. For our purposes, it is crucial to realize that for Sellers, semantical discourse is all about classifying linguistic items with regard to the functional roles which govern their use. To cut a long story short, let us just take a quick look at Sellers' familiar reinterpretation of meaning statements, according to which rot in German means red is equivalent to star-quoted rots in German are dot-quoted reds. According to Sellers, meaning statements are metalinguistic statements which provide us with the functional role played within a certain language by linguistic items that instantiate a particular sign design. Thus, rot in G means red tells us that in the German linguistic economy, occurrences of the character string ROT perform a particular functional role which is solely identified as the functional role played by red in English. As Sellers sees it, this account applies with minor modifications to the other kinds of semantical statements as well. Hence, semantical discourse provides us with a way to label and distinguish functional roles, but it doesn't take us directly to the rules which constitute these roles. To advance further, our phenomenologist has to rely on her linguistic competence again. Thus, she could take her keen sense for the sameness of functional roles as a guide for reconstructing complex functional roles as complexes of simpler functional roles. The classical project of conceptual analysis is, of course, just one way in which the competent use of a semantical metalanguage may help the phenomenologist to get a grip on the conformation rules of a language as well. I think that it has become clear by now what Sellers might have had in mind when he characterized the phenomenology of linguistic functions as, quote, the systematic exhibition of the rules of a language by the use of that same language, unquote. Before taking the final step in our argument, we should at least note in passing that, taken in isolation, this internal route to language as norm has at least two serious disadvantages. However masterfully undertaken, the reach of the phenomenology of linguistic functions is still limited in principle by the fineness of the distinctions inherent in our metalinguistic behavior. In addition to that, as a consequence of its reliance on the resources of a semantic metalanguage, phenomenology runs the risk of encouraging a misleading conception of what language actually is. Thus, it could help to sustain an erroneous belief in what Sellers sometimes calls rationalistic pseudo-psychologies, which take quasi or quasi-objects of semantic analysis, such as meanings or mental contents, for scientifically respectable objects. In the fall of 1948, Sellers begins to develop an alternative route to language as norm, which absorbs insights from the scientific study of language, thus steering a middle course between the phenomenology of linguistic functions and empirical science. The central element in Sellers's new approach is the construction of simplified models of linguistic behavior as it ought to be. These language games are supposed to capture norms which we espouse by recreating the ideal which governs our factual linguistic behavior. At bottom, such an ideal is, so to speak, the depiction of a happy world, a world in which we succeed to behave just as we ought to behave. The depiction of the ideal to which our linguistic behavior ought to conform is, of course, not a description in the strict sense of the term, as its correctness is not subject to the standard of factual truth. Still, we have to make use of the descriptive resources of our language in order to construct our model of it. Since, quote, in the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, unquote, it seems clear that in constructing models of ideal linguistic behavior as it should be, one should heed the results of the scientific study of human behavior. Thus, it seems advisable to take the naturalistic object language of the empirical scientist as the model language. Beginning with language rules and behavior, this is what Sellers does. I like to refer to this project as Sellers' naturalistic pragmatics. The first fully articulated version of this naturalistic approach to the normative structure of our language is to be found in some reflections on language games. As I see it, we should think of Sellers' naturalistic pragmatics as his attempt to arrive at a true via media between rationalistic a priorism and descriptivism, unquote. This last and final quote of my manuscript is from Language Rules and Behavior. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions.
Okay, so first off, thank you for that great talk. It was very very enlightening, at least from my perspective. I had two sort of related questions about this last quotation that you have from CMSP on the handout. And I was just wondering, as you understand Sellers, how is phenomenology different from something like Wittgenstein's showing in the Tractatus? Because it sounds like earlier you quote Sellers as sort of distancing himself from, I took it, that same sort of move in the Tractatus. But again, this sort of systematic exhibition of the rules of a language by the use of that same language sort of gets me thinking in terms of Wittgensteinian showing. So the first question, and the second one is just to get clear on, because I'm still, I think, sort of confused that in the first sentence there, it sounded like phenomenology is about the object language and the rules and norms in the object language. But then in the second sentence, it's saying you're using the meta language, not that same object language. So I guess I'm probably just missing something about how those two sentences relate to each other. So I was wondering if you could say something. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps I should begin with your second question. I think the crucial thing to realize at that point is that the job of philosophy is, so to speak, to get at the ideal which governs our factual linguistic behavior. And the rules where we use such words as sentence, true, and actual seem to be immediately related to that ideal. They are, so to speak, parts of our of our internal, or not sure what a good expression would be. They are part of our onboard mechanisms for explicating these norms, in the sense of that they provide us with the first grip on the norms to which we ought to conform. And I think that might perhaps be perhaps this might indicate the rough direction in which we have to look in order to bridge this gap. I should also say, I mean, it might have it might have seemed somewhat peculiar that I was only drawing on that single passage from quotation marks, sentences, and propositions in order to explicate or to say something about phenomenology. Actually, in Sellers's published works, we find fleeting remarks or reference to phenomenology every now and then. I mean, there are certainly several passages in which Sellers briefly comments on phenomenology, even in his in the latest phase of his philosophical development. But what is really interesting about this period about which I was talking, I mean, I was talking quite precisely about the year. About the years 1949, 1950, 1951, perhaps. That in that period we find really rich and important materials within Sellers's unpublished works, which elaborate on the conception of philosophy. For example, there is his manuscript Outlines of a Philosophy of Language, and in that manuscript, phenomenology plays a very, very important role. Sellers distinguishes there between two different approaches to conceptual systems. The first approach being what he calls the phenomenology of linguistic functions, and the second approach being what he in that manuscript calls empirical science. Okay, but sorry. Perhaps I comment on the first of your questions at some other time.
Okay.
Thanks, Boris. Um, so you want to say that when Sellers abandons the language of formalism, he doesn't abandon the picture of philosophy that he had when he was using it. And so one of the things I was wondering about is the way he used the word formalism in his early papers was precisely to mark out a strong demarcation between philosophy and science.
And science, yeah.
And later on in his career, for instance, in Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, he no longer sees that. He sees the difference between philosophy and science more as a matter of emphasis, rather than as a matter of, strong demarcation, right? Yeah. And so I'm wondering whether you see the development of the sort of metaphilosophical view here as just a continuation of what you're describing here, or whether you see that when he abandons the language of formalism, he's already abandoned that metaphilosophical prospect? Or, so do you see what question I'm asking? Like, is that a further development? Yeah. Or, because I can see how, if you think that formal is opposed to material, that it's very clear why philosophy is different from science, or it's clear enough why philosophy should be different from science if science is concerned with the material. But once you abandon that absolutely stark distinction, the waters seem to get muddied at that metaphilosophical level. And so I'm wondering whether there is some kind of change in his metaphilosophical attitude already in what you're describing, or whether you can describe this in such a way that further changes later, or whether you don't see that further change as a change at all. Okay.
This is a very good question. Thank you very much for it. I would like to commit myself to the view that there are no really significant metaphilosophical shifts in Sellers' philosophical development, and I would argue that when Sellers in his later philosophical writings seems to outline a conception of philosophy which appears to be more in tune with the science. One crucial difference still remains in place and functioning, and that is, so to speak, the difference between an endeavor which is taken out in the object language, that would be science, and an endeavor which is taken out at the meta-conceptual level in a suitably broad sense of that term, and that would be philosophy. I think that even in his later writings, when Sellers seems to endorse the conception of philosophy, which seems to be really close to empirical, to first of all empirical science or something like that, even then the important thing to see is that the philosopher is still concerned with our conceptual system. So what I would really like to say is, so to speak, that the object of philosophy is our conceptual system, and I would go on to say that a conceptual system is not a factual entity, can I put it that way? As I see, the conceptual system is, so to speak, an ideal object which is entirely constituted by norms and which has a certain counterpart in the empirical world, but which should not be confused with that counterpart.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you very much for a good talk. I want to follow up with a question on exactly the thing that you just said a moment ago, and I'm confused about why you think, and why Sellers would think, if he does think it, that language is that the description of our conceptual system or the description of our language is not a factual description, but something other than that, right? Now, it can't very well be, here's one first stab at it, that it's metalinguistic, okay? That can't be right, because that would make it that linguistics can't be a science, that you can't have a science of language. You can have a science of tables and chairs and everything else, but language is this one special thing that you can't have a science of, right? That would be a very, that would be at least, I'm not sure why that view would be tenable, but I think what you were saying is, well, look, the real reason it's not a factual description is because in describing language, we're not describing language as it actually occurs, the actual warts and all details and all the mistakes and all the things that people make, but we're describing an ideal. And that's really what puts it out of the realm of the factual and puts it into the realm of the something other than factual. Yeah. But here, I want to lodge an objection, and I want to see if you what you might say in response. Chomsky, who is a paradigmatic studier of language, scientist of language, says the same. He says, I don't care about performance, what I call performance, how people actually talk and what people actually do. I care about this thing that I'm going to call competence, which is an idealization. Okay. Yeah. And yet Chomsky takes himself to be talking about a natural object. He thinks he's doing natural science when he performs the idealization. And if you ask them, why do you think so? What he would say is, well, I'm just doing the same as the physicist when the physicist is talking about not real gases, but ideal gases, or not real planes, but frictionless planes. What an idealization does is it abstracts away from certain elements of what's real to get at the essences or the heart of what's real by abstracting away from things that are irrelevant, by things like friction or performance error. So my objection is that in moving from the full detailed warts and all description of language to an idealized thing, it's not clear to me that we've moved from facts to norms. Yeah. It seems that all we've moved from is facts to abstracted facts, or dirty facts to clean facts, or something like this, right? So I'm not really sure where norms are coming into the picture, and how idealization is supposed to automatically give us norms, as opposed to just giving us a cleaner picture of what we're interested in studying, factually.
Okay, to put my cards right on the table, I'm actually endorsing a very, very emphatic conception of an ideal, so to speak. As I understand it, or as I meant or wanted to use that term in my talk, an ideal is something akin to what Kant called a regulative ideal, and I would even tend to say that there is perhaps even some sort of a, I almost don't dare to say it, some sort of a moral dimension to it, but I'm certainly not really prepared to defend that point on the spot. I have to think about it much more carefully in order to do that. But I would like to comment or to say something about another part of your comments. In my paper, I had a passage in which I tried to draw a distinction between what the approach of an anthropologist to functional roles might be and what the approach of a philosopher to functional roles might be, in contrast to that anthropological approach. And the way I wanted to play it was that there is a difference in not regarding the object, so to speak, but regarding the pragmatic function of what the anthropologist and the philosopher wants to do respectively. As I put it in my paper, the anthropologist aims to describe systems of functional roles which are in one way or another already effective in the causal empirical world. I don't say that there are functional roles in the empirical world, because on my account those roles are ideal or normatively constituted items, and so they cannot be in the empirical world plain and simple. But there is, it does certainly make sense that there are complicated arrangements of social practices in our empirical world which can be described by drawing on the concept of functional roles or some concepts which is akin to that. I mean, that's exactly what cultural anthropology actually does, doesn't it? And what I wanted to say is that the philosopher is not really interested in describing those social practices by drawing on on the notion of a functional role, but to explicate the functional roles which should bind us, so to speak, as rational beings. Yesterday in Jeremy's talk, we heard quite a bit about collective intentions, Salazar's we intentions, and I think in the end that's the way to go in order to make this distinction really sharp. And so that would be my answer to that part of your comment.
This is just actually kind of following on from what David said. It seems to me that it's important to remember that Seller's metalinguistic approach is a nominalist approach, such that we have to be Humeans about this, in that norms or laws are explained by their instances or tokenings, right? So in this sense, we are not vice versa, and not vice versa.
No, I think I wouldn't quite agree.
Okay, just let me finish through.
Okay. Sorry, yeah.
In which case, and so if you don't agree, maybe you're not going to be on board with what I'm going to say next then. In the next case, if you don't think that's well, what I'm going to say is that if that is true, then we're into what Hugh calls subject naturalism. We're interested in explaining how natural creatures come to talk in the ways that they do, in which case then a formalization starts to look like, in the broadest sense, linguistic anthropology, and in a much more specific sense, the kind of psycholinguistics that David gave us yesterday.
I actually have to correct my initial response to your worry. I certainly don't think that it's okay. Perhaps there is a way in which it would make sense to say that linguistic norms are to be explained by reference to linguistic tokens, but it seems to me to be of the very utmost importance to realize that the linguistic tokens in questions are what Sellers calls volitions or intentions, or then that special subclass of intentions which Sellers refers to as valuations. But in a way, that's what the anthropologist would be interested in. He would, so to speak, be interested in reconstructing some potentially quite complicated arrangements of valuations within a certain group of linguistic beings. But what I want to say is that the philosopher is, so to speak, is interested in a different matter. He is not interested in those valuations as they, as a matter of fact, occur within certain linguistic beings, but instead he's interested in those valuations which an ideally rational being should have. I totally see that this is just a rough indication of the direction, but okay. Good.
We have just a couple minutes left.
So I don't know if this will be a good or a bad thing. I'm going to follow up on David's question and therefore on Russell's question also. Sorry. One little footnote. Somebody might think that, Chomsky might think, in most of his career, that you can have a science of language that doesn't include a science of semantics. And it's, of course, the semantic or conceptual area that we're focusing on here. But if we can see that you can have a science of semantics in the anthropological way that you're conceding, then it seems to me not obvious what the philosopher's concern is. So I have two worries. One is you're resting your argument to some extent on a demarcation of philosophy and science, which at least Sellers may have had early on, but then seems, as was earlier remarked, to have given up. And, well, seems in some way to have given up in any case. So it may be more a matter of degree than of the kind of question it is. But I don't see how one gets to answer the question of what a rational being per se should mean, or how a rational being should use ... dog ... or any of those things without really extracting that information from the rational beings that you have on hand.
Okay.
So it's really that last part that I would pose as a challenge. And I just say in connection with rules, you spoke very often of rules governing and rules regulating and so forth, and this just seems to be an empirical matter, if that's what rules are doing. So to the extent to which that's what rules are doing, this is something that you could study in a normal scientific way.
Okay. Thank you very much for this question. As I've already said in response to Michael, I actually would like to hold that such a sharp demarcation between philosophy and the empirical sciences makes sense for the totality of Sellers's oeuvre. I'm absolutely clear about that I haven't in the least provided an adequate argument for this claim, and this would, I'm afraid, go well beyond the scope of the present occasion. But did I? Okay. Sorry, I've just to try to remember what I wanted to say in response to.
Well, my main
Yeah.
thought was,
Yeah.
how do you get
Okay.
get anything
Yeah.
that's for rational beings
Yeah,
generally,
yeah.
as opposed to just extracting that from the rational beings that you happen to have lying around?
Thank you very much for reminding me about this point. And what I refer to as Sellers's naturalistic pragmatics is actually intended to go, so to speak, a decisive step towards the empirical sciences and their results. As I see it, Sellers is absolutely convinced that in doing or in trying to achieving this aim of explicating the norms which govern our linguistic behavior, the philosopher should draw on the results afforded by the sciences. And my idea was that, so to speak, the bottom-up alternative to top-down phenomenology would be to sit down as a philosopher and to construct language games as so to speak, a setup of functional roles which are nevertheless realized in the empirical world, and in the specification of that empirical world in which these functional roles are realized, we should definitely draw on the best input we get from the sciences on these questions. Everything else wouldn't be a very good idea. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much.